Good morning, everybody. My name is Petri Ahokangas. I come from Oulu Business School and I'm part of the 6G flagship here. Today we have the 6GSymposium's first session on the topic Winning Ideas, Legitimation and Acceptance. That will serve as a starting session for the day's other sessions that are focusing on the business, societal impact, and technology from the perspective of how to make money out of that. So this is a business day for the whole session. And today with me, we have here three discussants, David Pollington, Erkko Autio, and Norman Fraser, representing a little bit different perspectives. I will let the gentlemen introduce themselves as a part of their own presentations, so I'm not going to go through who they are in detail. You will learn. But I will share my screen. I hope that will work nicely. And now it should be online. Can you confirm that it's fully visible here? Very good.
That's good.
Thank you. Okay, so what we have here today is that we are talking about this. What's the purpose of 6G? How it's going to develop, what it is going to be about, and in that, well, the important notion that how we make it a legitimated, accepted thing that is going to be adopted by the users, accepted by the regulation, and really made a commercial success. So from the scientific perspective, when we talk about legitimation, it's what we mean by legitimation is that an act or result of making something acceptable. So it's considered reasonable and acceptable in the business ecosystem as a whole. So that's the basic idea. And when it's acceptable, it also there's also a possibility to become a commercial success. In the discussion, we have here three different perspectives. David will be talking about the investor perspective. Erkko will come from the ecosystem perspective, and then Norman will talk about the entrepreneurial perspective to this, what 6G might be, how we will make it a commercial success, and what kind of things are there in the background that might influence it in practice. If we think about this, the way how we can approach the whole 6G issue here, the typical way that I'm looking at this comprises three different perspectives. The first one is technology as an enabler. Technology enables us to do things, and then we have regulation that gives the limitations for the things what we are capable of doing. But still, all the decisions concerning what we are going to commercialize, they are business decisions. So technology enables them, regulation maybe delimits them, but in the end, they are all business decisions. And now that we are looking at this business landscape that is here, then the question is that what's going to happen in the future and how we make 6G a commercial success. So there are different kind of visions already or scenarios presented that what is the practical way of looking at 6G things at the different levels of analysis. So the scenario picture that I've showed here is just showing one example of these ways of looking at the business from the user perspective. So we are expecting the 6G to change the landscape of the users by bringing in also machine users, community users, and even the society as a user on top of the humans. We have there different types of ways of doing business, from this traditional MNO mobile network operator perspective towards different kind of resource brokers, maybe edge computing capability-based businesses, and then of course the content-based over-the-top internet players activities. Then we might see that it influences the way how the markets are developing. Is it more like a harmonious, multi-local, dystopian or competitive world? And then how we are going to look at the geopolitical tensions that are now forming, that how they might have an impact on 6G developments. So that's a kind of big picture. So what we're going to do basically, the flow of the session would be that we have about 20 minutes here for the beginning discussion. So each of our gentlemen have here about 5 minutes to show a couple of slides. And then we will have a 20 minutes panel discussion. And then at the end, we have about 15 minutes Q&A for the audience. So you have the chat, and we have a moderator here. So we'll be collecting from the chat questions that are related to our discussion, or to some other things that you might be interested in to ask and hear the opinions of our discussants. So basically, for the discussion, we have only this kind of a generic idea here in the background to start with. So we'll be looking at the discussion that what we see as the biggest opportunities and challenges for making 6G accepted and a commercial success. So what we are expecting to see to be changed in the industry. And then secondly, what are the ways how we can overcome the challenges and fully exploit the opportunities of 6G. So maybe the question is that what can or should we do from our perspectives in this discussion? And then we have the discussion questions from the audience. So that's the basic idea for the whole session. But I will stop sharing now and give floor to my other discussants to start with the discussion. So David, the floor is yours for the next about 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, and good morning to everyone. So my name is David Pollington. I work at Block Ventures. I'll tell you a little bit more about Block in a second. So, I mean, essentially my background is I've been working in the mobile telco industry for 27 years. So I spend a lot of time working at Vodafone as mobile phones basically transition from being very simple communication devices into fully featured sort of data-centric, web-centric devices. My role in all that time has really been one of being a technologist. So I worked a lot in R&D, leading a number of R&D teams across different geographies. I then moved across from Vodafone into the GSMA, and I did a very similar role at GSMA, working with mobile operators on a worldwide basis. And I did that for about 10 years. And then about 6 months ago, I moved into Block Ventures. So Block Ventures is a deep tech venture company. And we specialize in investments in the sort of communications, connectivity, data science, security, cloud type space. So very much on a par with what we're talking about today. Go to the next one, please. So I guess, you know, from my perspective, you know, before we start sort of diving into a discussion around 6G, I think we need to sort of pull back a bit and look at really what's happening in the world around us. And really there's this confluence of the web and cloud and connectivity with everything really now coming together. And there's a lot of blurring of the boundaries, and there's a lot of companies traditionally coming from the cloud space that are now moving into telcos. You've got people like Amazon offering sort of mobile private networks. And similarly, you've got the mobile operators trying to go up the value stack, especially in things like enterprise and industrial IoT, to provide end-to-end solutions to their customers. So, you know, I think for me today, one of the interesting things is going to be, you know, how do we really sort of look at everything that's going on and bring all parties to the table to actually have something which is cohesive end to end. If you go to the next one. So, you know, one of the things that people talk about with 6G is really this melding of sort of the human, physical and digital worlds. And there's a couple of examples here. You know, firstly, these sort of immersive experiential sort of communication experiences, so extended reality, augmented reality, virtual reality. It's really about facilitating the ability to not only communicate with vision and sound, but also things like intents, feelings, moods, etc. So it's really connecting people at a much more sort of experiential level. Be very interesting to sort of see how that might actually pan out in practice. Especially in relation to things like the metaverse. And then more on the industrial side of things, this sort of notion of a programmable physical world. So we're already seeing people starting to model either manufacturing plants or individual machines via a digital twin. And then through that, they can really identify and sort of simulate different scenarios and then go back and reprogram the physical machine or the physical environment to optimize things like efficiency, power efficiency, performance, etc. And we're seeing this across a whole range of industries: networks, public infrastructure, industrial IoT. And of course, all of this is going to be highly dependent on connectivity to enable all of these machines to be wirelessly connected and to be much more adaptable. Go to the next one. So, you know, this is going to require a fundamental shift in the architecture and the underlying atomic enablers that we need within a 6G framework. Again, a couple of examples here. So one is intelligence. So really we need to sort of imbue this sort of new digital fabric with native intelligence. So rather than it being, if you like, an afterthought, building some kind of intelligence on top of a data packet framework, we really need it for it to be intrinsic within the actual connectivity itself. So when we start talking about sensing, sort of cognitive networks, positioning, but also things like privacy and trust. So arguably that's, one of the key elements that has been missing from the web is this intrinsic layer of identity and trust. And this is now what a lot of people are starting to look into. And that then sort of links into decentralization. And really there's, again, sort of two perspectives on this. There's the ideological perspective. There's a lot of folk really driving for essentially ownership to be given back to the citizens. People should be able to own their data, manage who they are on the internet. But there are also these practical aspects in terms of a lot of industrial applications where you need to actually be doing the processing much closer to the data origination point. So that's where we need to have more sort of federated, distributed AI and sort of edge processing type capabilities. But we still need to be able to get the data from the sensors to the AI, do the inference, and then get those insights, up into the cloud to be used by the wider services. So again, it's all about connectivity. Go to the next one. So, delivering all of this is going to be very challenging. The solution space has outgrown the ability of any one industry or standards body to define it. So, arguably that's already happened with 5G and perhaps even 4G. So definitely with 6G, this isn't something that the telcos can define. This has to be collaborative across the wider set of industries. And it needs to be an iterative approach. So, a bit of a question mark here. Do we really need yet another G? Should we be calling this 6G at all? Or are we actually going to see a continuum where we go through 5G, 5G advanced, and we gradually build in a set of enablers, not necessarily coming from the telco community, but coming from cloud or from the web community, that then integrate into what we're able to achieve from a connectivity standpoint and create this kind of homogeneous set of capabilities for delivering new innovative services. So we'll have to wait and see. I think, was there one more? Yeah, okay. So just then in terms of, how we actually facilitate this kind of digital fabric, it's going to have to be made up of these sort of more composable resources and this concept of orchestration. So we're already seeing this in the telco space with things like Open RAN. But really, we need things like the connectivity itself to be as consumable as cloud resources. It's very easy for enterprises to access processing, storage, memory, etc. in the cloud. They should be able to access connectivity, and they should be able to configure that themselves dynamically using DevOps type interfaces. So there's one company there, Zeta, I'm just flagging that enable that kind of orchestration. And then similarly, rather than being locked into single vendors in the cloud, increasingly now corporates have policies where they have to be able to embrace a multi-cloud approach. So they need to be able to move their workloads, move their applications and services between different cloud providers to give them the most flexibility and the lowest cost. So there's another company there, Yellow Dog, that are sort of orchestrating in that space. But really, the key takeaways here is it's all about this open and inclusive ecosystem to really encourage these new entrants, new ideas and innovation. But, the big caveat that I'm sure we're going to get into in today's panel are all of the barriers that we're going to face. So there's cultural differences amongst all the standards bodies, if you compare the way that telcos do standards versus the web folk or cloud. There's divergent corporate interests. There's obviously geopolitics increasingly these days. And there's the IP handcuffs. The folks that have the biggest R&D budgets can go ahead and actually define 6G from an IP standpoint and basically close it off to smaller players and innovation. So that's another barrier. So there's a few bits and pieces there for people to think about. I'm sure we'll come back to some of these a bit later on the panel, and I'll hand back to Petri.
Right, thank you, David. Next, we have Erkka. Well, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Petri. And hello, my name is Erkko Autio, and I have spent the last few years with my colleagues Hervé Legendre and Ari-Pekka Hammeri exploring how open technologies can be harnessed to drive the evolution of digital infrastructures. And we are talking about the kinds of ecosystem contexts that were mentioned previously. So the background for my approach is that the shifts to 5G and subsequently to 6G are driving network functionality virtualization and software-defined networking adoption in telecommunications. And communication service providers increasingly have to rely on open technology-based cloud resources to manage shared physical networks and deliver their services. This then is forcing telecommunications equipment and service providers to adopt an increasingly open mindset, as illustrated by the numerous foundations dedicated to advancing open technology adoption. For telecom, key projects include the Open RAN, Telecom Infra Project, ONAP, the Linux Foundation, and open technology projects such as Magma, the Mobile Core Network Platform, and these then interact with open technology cloud platforms such as Kubernetes, and open hardware technologies such as RISC-V and the Open Compute Project. A recent example, of course, is Nefio, which seeks to deliver carrier-grade, entirely cloud-native Kubernetes-based platforms to simplify the management of large-scale edge deployments. Given the importance of AI and machine learning, open AI platforms such as PyTorch and TensorFlow are also becoming increasingly central. Now, all of this means that to understand infrastructural innovation and technology adoption therein, we really need to understand open technology dynamics in digital infrastructures, and this is an underexplored area. So we studied this question in the context of cloud infrastructures and the AI and machine learning ecosystem. We looked at open technology projects at different layers of the digital infrastructure through the lens of numerous projects as shown here. For a close-up look of open technology maneuverings, we looked at Google's open technology moves to set up and drive the AI and machine learning technology ecosystem over a period of 8 years. We saw how Google was able to strengthen its position in the cloud service ecosystem by releasing Kubernetes as an open source platform for cloud application orchestration. This move enabled Google to establish TensorFlow as the leading platform for AI and machine learning applications, to try the creation and demonstrations of practical use cases for AI and machine learning applications, which is a key bottleneck for AI and machine learning adoption. It then selectively released complementary technologies and datasets as open source and pre-trained machine learning models. This open technology strategy helped speed up the development of AI technology ecosystem considerably, and also allowed Google to establish for itself a position of influence within this infrastructure. So we have been looking at how individual players in these ecosystems maneuver to legitimate and drive technological developments. And what have we observed? We observed that at the level of individual players, we have seen a strategy roadmap of open technology adoption and leverage. At the lowest level, open technology adopters began using these technologies to gain innovation speed and achieve cost savings. They then often became open technology contributors to gain reputation advantages and drive their own internal capability development. So legitimation here mostly focuses inside the business and converting the mindset of the business to embrace open technologies. Particularly active contributors gain positions of influence where they can start steering the evolution of open technologies and harness ecosystem momentum to unblock critical bottlenecks that matter to them. Once a player has established an influential position in the open technology infrastructure, they can gain strategic leverage by mobilizing open technology ecosystems to undermine competitors' proprietary resources. A good example here is the Open Map project, which seeks to develop a substitute for Google's proprietary Google Maps. At the highest level of the game, players can start leveraging their influential positions in the general purpose technology infrastructure to gain cross-domain influence across adjacent sectors. A good example of this is how Google has harnessed the AI ecosystem momentum to develop a machine learning breakthrough by developing the ability to predict the shape of proteins from their amino acid structure. This is a potential game changer for pharmaceutical drug development, and Google recently launched isomorphic labs to exploit this breakthrough. I hope that in this brief introduction, I have managed to give you a flavor of how the open technology ecosystem can be played to speed up open technology development, adoption, legitimation, and ultimately drive infrastructural innovation. Okay, that was all. Back to you, Petri.
Thank you, Erkko. And then we have the entrepreneur's view. Norman, the floor is yours.
Norman, you are muted.
Yes, we can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay, my apologies. Very good morning to you. And in this conference about technology, I want to talk about the human dimension. Human beings are extraordinary in displaying amazing abilities to assimilate information and to make sense of it. And we do this by categorizing. Specifically, we tend to categorize new experiences in terms of what we already know. It's a way in which we reduce perplexity and get rid of noise. And it's a highly effective method that we have, but it can lead us in wrong directions. So in fact, it can give us a tendency to self-limitation, because in the face of really genuine innovation, instances of things that we've never seen before, we do struggle. We tend either to miscategorize the new things, the innovations, as examples of something that we already know, and hence we kind of diminish the new offer that these innovations make to us. Or alternatively, we fail to see the innovations as something to be taken seriously. We discard them as noise. And I started my career in technology research, fundamental research, and working in teams, we would come up with genuinely new and interesting and exciting intellectual property. And it used to drive me crazy how people in other parts of the organizations that I worked in would say, you do realize that you've only done the first 10% of the work that needs to be done to get this to market. And we were, of course, very conscious of the huge amount of effort that's required to create new technologies, the sheer invention, the new science. But over the last 30 or more years, I've been involved in starting a number of different innovation-driven IT companies. And I've had to come to terms with the reality that sometimes addressing the human dimension and the self-limiting nature of humans is a larger problem than the technical problem of creating wonderful new technological artifacts in the first place. And I'll give you just a few little anecdotes to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So my first startup was a business called Vocalis Group. And Vocalis was positioned in the early 90s at the interface of telephony and internet protocol, at that moment where the two were coming together and people were starting to talk about computer telephony integration. And we started to develop products and offerings that had previously been impossible, but they became possible as we could bring the two different things together to create new kinds of call center automation and optimization products. And these could really save money and make the lives of enterprises better, and indeed end users. And so we worked with customers, typically saving telcos, network operators between millions and tens of millions in recurring revenue per year. But again and again, we encountered the response from people as we talked about this new thing, this new marriage of old technologies. People would say things like, why on earth would I ever want to associate data with voice and move them around together? This was a wholly new idea to people, and they really struggled to see the value of it. And so we had to overcome that obstacle in order to make progress. In another of my businesses, Tricerion, we developed a low-cost, massively scalable, secure authentication system, if you will, an alternative login system, which had a compelling set of usability and security features. Untrained users could adopt it without any training or documentation, and it worked really solidly. In fact, in continuous use since 2006, that solution has never been phished. Now, what we found in trying to take this solution to market is a response where people said, well, we love the idea and we can see why it's highly secure, but we can't possibly adopt it, as that would involve asking our customers to accept a changed user experience. And so organizations continued to use traditional login technologies. And by the way, login is the oldest continuously used, unchanged, unupdated technology in IT. They preferred to use an insecure login method than ask the users to change. And very interesting dialogues were had around that, and continue to be had. In another business, Endava, it's a multinational IT services business, and essentially it offers nearshore software development services from a number of locations in Central Europe and in Latin America. And the business began when we created the first IT business in the post-Soviet era in the Republic of Moldova. And I accept that it may not have been the most obvious place to start serving Fortune 500 clients from, but there were many compelling reasons. People were talking at the time about a global software engineering skills shortage of around 1 million people. And the internet bubble was still growing at the time. And Soviet technical education was really very impressive. And there was a huge pool of untapped resources. But the response that we generally got in the market, as you might not be surprised to hear, was, are you crazy? The thing that surprised us was that in Moldova itself, at a time when 88% of the population lived on less than $1 a day and unemployment was really high, we really struggled to employ people because even those people thought that it was a crazy venture. Today, Endava has 11,000 staff and is listed on the New York Stock Exchange, so we must have got something right. But overcoming, legitimating the concept of the business in the first place was for sure the greatest obstacle in making the whole thing a success. So finally, the business that I spend most of my time with today is called SoftIron. And it highlights some of the ways in which standards, which, trust me, I believe in very much, can nonetheless serve to limit people's imagination and to delegitimize what would otherwise be useful activities. So for example, as you know, pretty much everything that happens in a data center runs on a platform of industry standard servers. And you want an industry standard there because you want to be able to interoperate between machines. You want your applications to run on any server, not just particular kinds of servers. But people have tended to assume that in order to achieve these kinds of interoperability benefits, you have to follow the standard architecture. And that's not just not true. We've demonstrated that so long as you keep the standard to the standards at the interface, by using completely alternative architectures, you can come up with solutions that dramatically outperform the industry standard on all measures. So for example, our servers consume at worst, a fifth of the energy. They take up half the size. Everything that happens at wire speed, whatever network you connect to, and so on and so on. Features that you just don't find in the standard model. Now, remember, this is a segment of the market that coined the phrase, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. And one of the things we found is that, of course, people struggle to get their heads around such a big change in a standards oriented world. One of the really amusing things we encountered is talking about data storage appliances, talking with an analyst from a major well-known analysis firm, business intelligence firm. He said, I got a problem with your servers. All of your servers are only 1 rack unit high. And I think the industry has pretty much decided that the right size for storage appliances is at least 2 rack units high. And no amount of trying to explain to him that people didn't make smaller machines because they hadn't figured out how to do it would change him from his view that our servers were too small. And the fact that you could store twice as much data in a data center seemed to carry no weight with him. We are a self-limiting species, and legitimation is a really important part of what we do, not just developing great technology, but helping people to embrace it as a good thing that will be good for life and that's worth taking seriously, not just writing it off as noise. We need to position innovative technology, including 6G with all of its wonders, for acceptance. And doing that involves much more than optimizing the technical feature set. It's about constructing a narrative that makes the radically new and apparently crazy seem like the most natural next step and something that's desirable. Legitimation is about helping people to interpret what they don't yet understand in terms of what they already know. And it's about it's about investing heavily in showing people benefits in ways that make sense to them long before we're asking them to open their wallets and to commit. So thanks for your time.
All right, thank you, Norman. I think that we've had a pretty nice overview of this legitimation problem. David, talking about inclusive ecosystemic innovation that is needed, then going to Erkko's openness strategies needed by the companies, and now coming to the human factor that we need to convince to be able to get things accepted. So given this kind of starting point, what would you see as the biggest opportunity for 6G from the business perspective at the moment? Of course, we know that 6G is not the next thing to come, but still, if you think about it from the opportunity perspective, that what should be addressed? Who would like to start?
Well, maybe I can say something. So what I see the biggest opportunity or challenge or the biggest game changer in my view is the adoption of AI and machine learning and implementation of those technologies in the context of 6G frameworks. So what's going to happen is that I believe that the basis of competitiveness will change in 2 ways. One is, when we compete in a proprietary world, then we own something that no one else owns, and then, our advantage is based on that. But in an open technology world, you have to keep contributing to those open technologies, and then you need to figure out that, well, okay, what do I build upon this? And, what is the wedge that with which I then monetize my contributions? And this is where the AI and machine learning, I believe, will come in, because training those machine learning models is costly. We are talking about data network effects. And what that basically means is that it's difficult, it takes time and energy to train those machine learning models. But once you have trained that, then you have a model that's better than anyone else's. And figuring out how to use that, how to, play the game that way, drive advances in machine learning models that are proprietary, and then using these to make money, appropriate value from the system. That is what I believe businesses need to figure out.
Right, very good. David?
Yeah, no, I guess just to build on what Erkko was saying there. So I think, one of the aspects obviously with 6G is around connectivity and, to facilitate, AI and machine learning. I think we need to move away from this notion that all the data has to be harvested from the sources and sort of bounced off the moon in the cloud, to create some kind of, insights that are then sort of actionable. What we're seeing, I think, is there's going to be a lot more applications that require processing closer to the edge. There's also the opportunity to harness things like swarm learning. So you can actually have multiple edge devices or edge nodes basically learning in tandem and sharing their knowledge. And I think this much more kind of distributed, federated approach to how we facilitate AI and machine learning, I think is going to be fundamental. And I think that's one of the key areas that 6G should really be focusing on.
Yeah, if I may add to that, that's a very important point that David makes here. And one idea in the past has been that, you have to own the data. If you are Google, you own your data, no one else can access your data. But as we are moving towards this, entirely open technology landscape, then we will have more and more shared data resources that might be cultivated by many different parties. And then the question is, how do you combine those to come up with something novel and new? So you have much more opportunities for generative innovation in this new landscape.
Yeah. Norman, do you have a comment for this?
I think a key thing is to identify the right opportunities. There's a real danger with the power of 6G that it gets used as a big stick, and the answer is always move lots of data around. So I'll give an example. If you think about adaptive suspension on cars, how you smooth the ride for cars. One way to do it is to crowdsource mapping of the road so that you can identify where all of the potholes are and then anticipate them and make the suspension adapt for them. Is that the right solution? It may be a solution that people are trying to follow today, but maybe there's a better way to do it at the edge without moving all of the data around. And so I think figuring out what the real game-changing applications are, the applications that can only be enabled by 6G is absolutely crucial.
I see the technology as an enabler here, but don't you see the regulatory side here kind of a limiting factor, because there's a lot of discussion ongoing, like, for example, at the EU level now about how we should regulate the use of AI. How do you see the regulatory or this regulation perspective to this AI opportunity that we have in 6G?
Well, if I may say something, the role of the regulator obviously always needs to be to enable things. The big bottleneck in this, mixed cloud AI communication service landscape, where open technologies pretty much are the object of, manipulation. The big bottleneck always for edge and everything else is the development, innovation, and demonstration of use cases. That's what really drives advances in the system, and that's what really ultimately drives the adoption of general purpose technologies. So we need to get those use cases, and we need to advance those use cases, and this is what Google did so excellently in their moves in the AI world. So for the regulator, I suppose one challenge is, and one opportunity also is, to promote the demonstration and experimentation of those use cases in selected areas, whether it be healthcare or elsewhere, where obviously you do have these privacy issues and issues that you always have with data. So promotion of use cases and regulations supporting that experimentation, I think, is important.
Yeah, there's another session later today about the regulatory developments in practice. Do you see some other enablers for the opportunities coming from 6G other than AI? I know that, for example, the HexaX project in the EU has been listing 5 families of use cases. And if you look at the ITU developments, I think there's hundreds of different proposed use cases in the air now.
I think just to sort of react a little bit to that point, I think, as I was saying in my presentation, we've got to be very careful here. If you wind back the clock, the telco industry started by defining telco services, and then it started, moving towards defining capabilities when we moved to things like data capabilities, packet networks, 3G, 4G, etc. I think it's dangerous for the telco community, at least, to be trying to second guess what the use cases need to be for 5G. If that's used as a way of identifying the atomic enablers that need to be developed and specified within 6G, then fine. But I think we've got to be very careful about trying to second guess what the connectivity requirements will need to be, and specifically what the services are going to look like, because I think that's where we need to open it up to more innovation. So as I was saying, having this more composable approach to how you actually define the network and democratizing and enabling anybody to essentially assemble the kind of connectivity that they need, I think is something that we need, and we're going to see more of as we go forward.
So you're seeing this kind of legitimation dilemma between that it shouldn't be too strictly defined so that it can emerge freely to exploit the opportunities and find the opportunities.
Yeah, and it's I think this is going to be the interesting thing, is really getting that balance, because you do still need to define within 6G, there's going to be sort of cognitive networks that are better able to actually auto configure themselves across heterogeneous different sort of access networks, radio networks. There's going to be things like spectrum sharing that perhaps is going to come in, dynamic spectrum sharing rather than static allocations. So there are certainly some fundamental things that 6G could be doing to actually provide a better landscape of connectivity. But I think the traditional approach of top-down trying to identify the killer applications that define the G, and then specifying technically what that G needs to do to deliver against those applications, that could be shooting ourselves in the foot. We'll see.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the key word is experimentation at the edge and not at the center. Look at IBM's Watson. IBM was leading AI developments 20 years ago. Where's Watson now? Well, why is it nowhere? Because IBM just had this proprietary mindset, and they tried to figure out what those use cases would be, and then their guesses were spectacularly wrong. And Google's open approach is completely different. It pushes experimentation towards the edge, and that's what you need in this kind of situation.
I think we've got to get away from the idea that AI is an application. AI is a tool, and actually I think an integral tool in the whole world of 6G for a whole variety of reasons, sometimes related to the sheer volume of data that can be harvested and transmitted, where the only way in which you can make sense out of it, especially if it's a real-time application, is by using AI. It's a tool set, so let's talk about them together. And because it seems to me that most of the most exciting applications of 6G are going to embed AI as an integral part of the solution.
So are we basically saying that we should not define what 6G will be or could be? We should kind of let it emerge. But then how do we get this global scalability to that? How can we make it a global standard if we allow that kind of thing? So should we let just markets decide?
No, I think obviously at the atomic level, you do need 6G to define capabilities that are then, standardized within 3GPP, and that everyone can then build to and deploy on a global basis. And we need that interoperability. That's the bedrock of the telco industry. I think it's just a case of being a little bit more sort of open and flexible in terms of then the sort of application service hooks and ties or capabilities that you might need on top of that base connectivity capability. Having some appreciation of the kind of things you might need to be doing but not, if you like, trying to be too prescriptive in terms of how you specify or define those application layers. I think, as everyone has been saying on this panel, it just needs to be much more sort of autocratic.
Yeah, my view on this kind of echoes with what you said. Yeah, I mean, this infrastructure is multi-layered. We have hardware at the bottom, then we have the data center infrastructure, the application orchestration layer. Then we start having the framework libraries, AI models, finally AI applications. So what needs to be done is to coordinate the development of the technologies that are lower in that technology stack. But then once we approach the use cases, that's where the experimentation needs to happen. And there you don't need standardization. So we have kind of a more private, proprietary world at the top, and then this kind of a shared open technology infrastructure supporting the surface.
All right, very good. I think it's time to move on to these questions from the audience, and we have a couple of here. So I'm just opening up the chat. I think that everybody can see what they are. So there's a statement that the telecom sector, the carriers have rigid or outdated business models. So what's the biggest mindset shift we need to have for those players in 6G to change the situation if compared to 4G or 5G? Or is this a leading question in a way?
I think, it's a difficult question in some respects because, arguably the value has gone, up the value stack. The telcos have really been suffering in terms of being able to accrue some of that value into their own businesses. Partnerships is really perhaps the way forward. As I said previously, a more sort of collaborative, partner-based approach in terms of delivering solutions into either consumers or to, different business verticals. I think that's then where everyone can share, the value more equitably, across the ecosystem. And I think that then will help to unlock and provide, business models that are more flexible and more, suitable to the target customers. So I think maybe that's what we need, is a more collaborative partnering type approach to unlock some of those new, more disruptive kind of business practices.
Yeah, as a researcher in this field, I fully agree, because it seems also within the specialists that understanding the business models that are here, it's kind of vaguely defined area, and what are the business models for operators, for example, in the future? That's an under-researched area. Huge opportunity for all the researchers and academics in the audience.
It's a very under-researched area. The big danger, if you are talking about telecoms operators, equipment providers, is that, historically, obviously, they had a strong proprietary mindset and selling closed systems, not open systems, and switching from that to really embrace open technology approach takes time. Obviously, telecom sector has, decades and decades of experience of standardization, but the systems they have been selling have still been proprietary. And then how do you navigate this new world where we are cultivating these shared resources that are open and accessible to everyone, and promoting experimentation? I believe that, the internet businesses such as Google's and Amazon's and others, I think they have an advantage there. And changing that mindset is, it can be tricky.
Yeah, that's true. In the industry is also strictly regulated. So that is not an aid here, I think. Very good. There's also a question to Norman about the dangers of legitimation. So would like to comment on that. Do you see what could be the dangers of legitimation?
Well, what are the dangers of adding a new dish to the menu in a restaurant? The danger is that somebody might think it sounds better. What are we going to say? That we don't allow ourselves to consider new possibilities. Of course we do. Legitimation is the process by which new things come to gain acceptance, and that involves typically elements of cognitive legitimation. People have to figure out, does this make sense to me? Does this make sense to my business or to my application? And legitimation also involves socio-political elements around everything from the way in which a new technology area gets taxed or regulated to whether whether the government starts buying the new technology and building systems on it. Of course, for me, the danger of legitimation is that the wrong things get legitimated, that suboptimal or not good things get legitimated. But think about when the wheel was first invented. It kind of undermined the sledge industry, but it was just a better solution. But even the wheel took some time for people to figure out as something that was worth having, and that moved, if you like, from the periphery to the mainstream. And that's those of us who are involved in innovative technologies, like everybody on this call, is in the business of coming up with new inventions, trying them out, seeing whether they make a difference. I think that that at the idea formation stage, the use of mock-ups and simulations and methods that allow people not to have to understand vague concepts, but somehow interact with things and figure out what works, makes a lot of sense. Just as you use mock-ups if you're developing an app, suddenly it brings everything alive. In the world of 6G, I think we need to be exposing people to what the 6G world could do for them, in order to help people to think of those apps and to come up with great things to do with what the technology will allow.
All right, thank you. I think that we are approaching the time limit that we have for the discussion. And I think that we haven't, well, given that 6G is really kind of putting together human, physical, and digital worlds, so there's huge opportunities, and there are huge expectations on 6G given by the industries, by the governments, by the different research programs that are now ongoing on 6G. I think that it's kind of impossible at this stage to define what it is. And I think it's also, if I listen to the message that you've been giving, is that we shouldn't be actually defining it too closely. Let it emerge and then make it more human-centric. And from the legitimation perspective, then the strategies, I think that there's this ecosystemic view, and maybe this kind of thing like ecosystemic acceptance that needs to be there coming somehow anyways. There needs to be the human acceptance from the users, also related to the different dangers of AI that might be there, or the data ownership issues that we've been discussing, or the security and privacy things. And then this maybe the openness strategy that is there with the experimentation culture. These are the key things we've been discussing today to make 6G legitimate, acceptable, commercial success in the future from the different perspectives. So I hope this somehow puts together the things that we've been discussing. I really want to thank you all for your contribution and interesting discussion today. And I also want to thank the audience for the questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't answer all the questions, but maybe we can come up later offline to talk these issues that we have raised in the chat and revisit this discussion. So the next session today will be focusing on then regulation and business from the different perspectives. So feel free to pop into the following sessions. They are kind of designed to be a series today and contributing on top of each other. And I hope that the whole day will then provide us a better understanding of what 6G could be and how we could make it a success. Thank you.